Welcome to Kasie DC. I'm Kasie Hunt. We are live every Sunday from Washington from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern. Tonight, 1 year after violence overtook the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, thousands take to the streets of Washington. Our NBC reporters are live all over the city. Plus, the president tries to cool the rhetoric, while one of his longtime collaborators accuses him of being a racist. And later, longtime listener, first-time caller. The president's legal team take their case to Drive Time Radio as the commander-in-chief assails his attorney general on Twitter. But tonight, the city of Washington, known for its history of nonviolent expression, is watching and waiting. A handful of white nationalists, just 2 dozen, gathered within sight of the White House earlier. Thousands more met them head-on during a rainy night here in the nation's capital. And I want to start with our team of reporters that has been out in the rain all day and night. I want to start with Garrett Hake. Garrett, you started your day at the Metro meeting this small group of protesters. Frankly, can you just walk us through what you've seen over the course of today?
Sure, Kasie, it was clear from the word go that this rally was not going to be everything that it was advertised as. When organizers put it together, they had told people to meet at the Metro in Vienna, Virginia around 2 o'clock so they could come into the city as a big group in a show of force and for their own protection. They got their protection from MPD once they made it into the District of Columbia, but there was no show of force. Only about 2 dozen or so folks under the banner of Jason Kessler, who is the organizer of this event in Charlottesville last year, and once again doing this Unite the Right Rally 2.0 here in D.C. today. The disorganization, the disunity, the lack of message was clear from the start. Most of these folks showed up. They didn't even have Metro cards, so they marched into the Vienna Metro station and then marched right up to the Metro card machine and had to slow themselves down to buy fare to get into the district. And the message was muddled from the word go as well. Kessler tried to tell me in an interview that this was not a racist event, that this was all about free speech. Then I started talking to some of the people who'd showed up with them, and 2 young white supremacists, there's really no other word for it, told me they considered white Americans to be the founding stock of this country, and that if you weren't a white European American, you were somehow less American than they. So no message unity. The ride in on the train was probably the highlight of the day for these guys because they had the press attention to themselves, and when they got into the city, they were completely and utterly overwhelmed by the thousands of counter-protesters that swarmed them every step of the way from the Metro here to Lafayette Park behind me and stayed with them all day long until they left.
Garrett, can I ask you, I've seen some traffic and some people, frankly, raising questions about whether these white nationalists were given separate cars on the Metro to bring them in to Washington, D.C. Since you were there, I mean, what did you see?
I was on the train. There was a car that was entirely white nationalists and reporters, but I don't know that that was done in the direction of anyone except people on the platform who also looked around and decided they didn't want to be in a Metro car full of white nationalists and reporters. There were other people on that train coming in from Vienna, but they were riding in different cars. It's not clear to me that that was done at the direction of police, rather just some good, sensible Virginians who looked around and said there's probably another car on this train they'd rather ride in.
Said I absolutely want to be no part of this. Okay, Garrett, thank you. Jeff Bennett, can you talk us through what you've seen from your vantage point? And also, obviously, after this happened in Charlottesville just 1 year ago, all the attention turned to President Trump and his really response or lack thereof to what we had seen in the streets of Charlottesville. How are things different this year?
Kasie, you're 100% right. And look, Jason Kessler, the organizer behind Unite the Right, the rally last year and this sequel rally, initially wanted to hold the follow-up in Charlottesville, but he was denied a permit there. So he then turned his attention to Washington, D.C., and the National Park Service approved his permit for what he called a white civil rights rally because the National Park Service says that they are forced to approve any First Amendment rights event. So he thought he was going to be coming, in closer proximity to President Trump, even though this is a weekend in which we know President Trump is at his private golf resort in Bedminster, where he's finishing up his week there. But we've seen the president just yesterday sort of issue that preemptive tweet where he says, I condemn racism on all sides. And so some people have really characterized that standing in stark contrast to what he said last year, where he drew this moral equivalence between the white nationalists, the white supremacists, and those who are protesting against him. However, some people have read that same tweet and said, look, the president still can't condemn these white supremacists. He can't call out their bad acts. So we have this tweet from the president today. Ivanka Trump, the president's daughter and White House aide, added her voice to all of this, saying that she condemns specifically racism, white nationalism, Nazism, says it has no place in our country. So the question is, what will the president say when he's in an unguarded, unscripted moment and he gets a question about this, whether it's an Oval Office spray, whether it's a South Lawn scrum, whether he's going to do an event tomorrow, there will be some press pool reporters there. What will he say when he's caught off guard? I think that will be far more illustrative and far more instructive. Kasie.
And we should note, of course, Jeff, that permit that you mentioned that was given to Mr. Kessler was for upwards of 400 people. He showed up with just 24. Jeff Bennett, thanks very much for your reporting. We'll be checking back in with you tonight.
Sure.
Meanwhile, I want to welcome in my panel here with me on set, former RNC chairman and MSNBC political analyst Michael Steele, White House reporter for the LA Times and MSNBC political analyst Eli Stokols, Democratic pollster and MSNBC political analyst Cornell Belcher, and the president of the National Urban League and former mayor of New Orleans, Mark Morial. Thank you all for being here tonight. And Michael Steele, I want to start with you as somebody who is, there is a lot being ascribed to what I think is still your party, although you have had some major differences over the course of the last year.
We're working that out.
But what do you read into what you saw today with this, frankly, dismal showing, and what the president has had to say about it so far?
Well, I kind of ignore the showing and all of that, because that's melodrama that will play itself out one way or the other. 24 people, 400 people, that is what it is. How that's ultimately framed, in my view, is what we have relied on in the past, and that is a president who speaks into the moment and clarifies and defines where we are as American citizens when it comes to this type of hate-filled response to fellow Americans. And the fact that the president is giving us sort of a lightweight response on Twitter, where he's, there's hate racism of all kinds. Okay, yeah, but we're specifically talking about this. All right, can you narrow it down for us just a little bit with respect to what's happening in your front yard? And the fact that he still can't do that, that to me is the lesson that every American should take from what we see this weekend. Mark
Morial, to Michael Steele's point, the president is not out front leading on this tonight.
The rally by the Unite the Right group was an absolute flop, a failure, a poor showing. 30 people, and all of this anticipation, all of this mobilization, all of the public resources spent by the city of Washington and the federal government and the taxpayers for 30 people to show up. But secondly, this was an opportunity for the president to make a forceful, unequivocal statement. Go look at Mitt Romney's statement. Look at Ivanka Trump's statement. Those statements are more on mark of the type of statement we'd like to see the president make. This is a moral moment. This is a moment where we expect the president to speak unequivocally. He seems to not be able to really get to the point where he condemns this awful ideology of white supremacy, white nationalism, wrapped in the embers of Nazism and anti-Semitism. We want and need our president to lead on this moral issue at this very difficult and challenging time in American history. We haven't heard that, and I think we should hear it.
Cornell Belcher, first of all, your perspective on what we've seen unfold in the streets of Washington today, and what kind of lasting damage might President Trump be doing to Republican relationships with the GOP for African Americans who are thinking about where can I have a home?
Right. No, and where can I have a home is a big issue. Look, we've seen in a lot of polling and CBS polling, and we did polling in battlegrounds for African Americans for Black PAC, and you have over 70% of African Americans thinking that racism is on the rise, right? So and a majority think that their communities are under attack. So that's the sort of reality it is for minorities, for many minorities who thought so much of this was in the past. Right now, we're again watching, Ku Klux Klan and white supremacists march through the streets of Washington, right? But I also, at the same time, to the chairman's point on this, is the 30 people showing it doesn't mean anything, right? Because we understand as a strategy they're going underground, and when you look at sort of the racism that I think Trump is making okay again in this country, that's going to hurt us long term. Because one of the things I've talked about before is we're not going to get whiter as a country, so we better figure out how to live with each other, whether you're Republican or Democrat. We've got to do a better job of figuring out how to live with each other, and the president must play a central role in that.
Yeah, Eli Stokols, from a political perspective, I mean, this is a president who feeds off crowds. He watches what happens in front of him. He tosses things out to the crowd. He sees how they react to it. And oftentimes he'll continue to say something because it seemed to resonate. It doesn't seem to me that this small group of extremists really had any sort of showing that should suggest that this is something with a real constituency.
No, if he's watching TV tonight, and we have no reason to think that he's not, because he watches TV pretty much every day. He's seeing this, and he is not going to he's not going to take satisfaction. He's not going to claim credit. If anything, he might distance himself from it. But before he could see the crowds, as everybody here has pointed out, he had a chance to make a strong statement condemning not all kinds of racism, but specifically white supremacism. He did not do that. And for better or for worse, the White House and the president is really good at giving these kind of mealy-mouthed statements that are open to interpretation. So he can say, I condemned racism. What do you want me to do? But he can leave enough room there for people who want to march in these rallies or attend these meetings or pop off on Facebook with racist ideas. He can leave enough daylight for them to think he's actually with us. That protest that we saw in Charlottesville a year ago, that hadn't been seen before Donald Trump was president. And from all the reporters who were in the crowd talking to people, the majority of the white supremacists who showed up believed, rightly or wrongly, that this president was on their side, that he understood them differently than past presidents, past political leaders before, and there was an excitement about that. And if that is not the case, it's incumbent on the president to send a stronger message to say, I do not support this, and as yet he has not.
Michael Steele, this is a question that Chuck Todd asked of a member of Congress on Meet the Press a week or two ago. He asked, is the Republican Party becoming a party that is fundamentally anti-black?
I won't know if I'll go that far yet. We have our roots, though. I mean, we have our roots when there was a Southern strategy from the Nixon campaign in '68 to bring into the fold this particular ilk of person, to put it politely, this kind of trash, because there was some electoral benefit, presumably, that would come from it. There was no consideration given to the poison that would infect the body politic within the GOP, that here we are now, some 50 years later, having to deal with a president, a Republican president, who, to the point that was just made, gives countenance to it, that gives room to that. So the party has to now, irrespective of the president, the party has to account for this. Because I don't know how we go into a black community, into a Hispanic community, and say, come, join us, be a part of us. It's not enough to say you're conservative. It's not enough to say you go to church on Sundays. It's not enough to put all that out there on the table anymore. When you've got this body of work by this administration, you've got the rhetoric and everything else that says something very different to communities of color in this country. And it's a real problem.
Mark Morial, jump in.
I want to offer, yes. So I think it's an interesting arc, if you will, from George Bush circa 2001, talking about affirmative access, appointing Colin Powell and later Condoleezza Rice as secretaries of state, a GOP in the Congress that had a J.C. Watts in its leadership, and a GOP that had a Michael Steele as its chair. That party, which seemed to be maybe making small steps, is a very different scene today. A Michael Steele, a J.C. Watts, a Colin Powell, a Condi Rice, they were prominent in the Republican movement of the early 2000s. Now you see something very different. This is a directional shift when you've got a Corey Stewart, a Patrick Little, as candidates nominated or candidates running under the GOP banner. So I think the difficulty for the GOP is not only in its leadership optics and in the president's rhetoric, but also the fact that there are no longer any credible African Americans in any leadership role anywhere, it seems, in the Congress or in the executive branch. It's hard to make up, particularly when you've got a changing landscape in the country, not to even mention the lack of Latino leaders in the very same party. So you've got to look at this in terms of where it's come from maybe 15 years ago to where it is. It's directionally in the wrong direction if you consider the demographic shifts in the country for the GOP.
Fair points. We are just getting started here on Kasie DC. We're going to take you back live to the streets in Washington as some of the most dramatic moments come from Antifa protesters. Plus, a reality show plot twist 15 years in the making. Omarosa throws the book at the president. We're back after this.
Mr. President, do you feel betrayed by Omarosa, sir?
Send him back out the way!
Lowlife. She's a lowlife. Okay, thank you, everybody.
But I will say this to you. I was complicit with this White House deceiving this nation. They continue to deceive this nation by how mentally declined he is, how difficult it is for him to process complex information, how he is not engaged in some of the most important decisions that impacts our country. I was complicit, and for that, I regret.
Welcome back to Kasie DC. Omarosa has now been relegated to the list of people that the president has dismissed as lowlifes. That includes Ted Cruz, Eric Erickson, Snoop Dogg, and, quote, some lowlife writer at the Washington Post who's not Bob Costa. I wish I knew off the top of my head who that was. After comments like that, it is easy to forget that Omarosa and the president were collaborators in one way or another for nearly 15 years.
I want you to go out to Las Vegas, meet these guys, and over a period of weeks, you're going to decide whether or not there's somebody for you. Goodbye, sweetheart. Good luck. Have a good time.
But will it work? The new show on TV One is called Donald J. Trump Presents the Ultimate Merger. Donald and Omarosa, welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, describe the right guy for Omarosa. What kind of a guy should Omarosa be?
I don't know if there is a right guy. I don't think there's any man in the world that can handle this.
Come on.
She's tough. She's smart. She's tough. But she's good. You know, she's got a good heart. I will say that.
And there was a reason that you always, you liked her, even though you had trouble with her in the beginning. But
No, I hated her from the beginning, but I also loved her. And the show went to #1 on many weeks, as you know.
Are they all rich guys? Who are these guys?
Well, Donald chose a mixture of 6 very wealthy guys and the other 6 not so much. And he wanted to see who I would end up with.
Okay. And Omarosa defended the president, even in the wake of her departure, some would say firing, from the White House. And that includes in the wake of his response to the Charlottesville rally.
I would never sit nor work for someone who I believe to be a racist.
Many people feel that the president at worst is a racist and at best is a sympathizer for white supremacists. Is he?
Donald Trump is racial, but he is not a racist. Yes, I will acknowledge many of the exchanges, particularly in the last 6 months, have been racially charged. Do we then just stop and label him as a racist? No.
Times have changed. And now Omarosa is leveling accusations at the president, including that she has heard a tape of him using a racial slur.
And I know it exists. And what I regret is that these people are probably trying to leverage it as this October surprise. I don't want to be a part of that. But I have heard for 2 years that it existed, and once I heard it for myself, it was confirmed what I feared the most, that Donald Trump is a con and has been masquerading as someone who is actually open to engaging with diverse communities. But when he talks that way, the way he did on this tape, it confirmed that he is truly a racist. Being used by Donald Trump for so long, I was like the frog in the hot water. You don't know that you're in that situation until it just keeps bubbling and bubbling. It's clear in hindsight.
The White House disputes many of her claims. We are going to welcome into our conversation here former U.S. Attorney and MSNBC contributor Joyce Vance. And Joyce, I'm going to get you to weigh in on the legality of taping something in the Situation Room in just a moment. But first, Cornell Belcher, you were watching that tape of Omarosa and shaking your head. Please, do tell us what you were thinking.
Well, I was thinking so many different things. One is actually I want to hold a lot of my time for, I know she's your BFF, Chairman Still. So I'm going to give you a lot of the time here. But you know, she says she's not the best vehicle for this, but what some of the things she said on Meet the Press they do ring true. Like he can't grasp knowledge and information. He's challenged, but she's such a bad vehicle on it because the idea that Omarosa didn't know that he was a racist and that Omarosa didn't know he was a bad person until the point where she was benefiting from it, right? And it's sad to see. Reality television has eaten our culture, and now it's eaten our politics.
Michael Steele, the difference between racial and racist, I mean, she seemed to be kind of really struggling to make that distinction in the first instance.
It's silly. It is silly. You know, he's being racial. Oh, okay. No, racist. Just call it what it is. And the fact is she couldn't at the time because she was all up in it. She was, you know, in the White House. She was part of Trump world doing her thing. And now she is presumably outside of that. I'm still not convinced that that's really the case. Those two are two sides of the same coin, all right? And she's talking about, you know, he calls her a lowlife. Well, Donald, that's your lowlife. You created that lowlife. You gave impetus to that. So now you're reaping what you've sowed. And we're all supposed to now fall down and go, oh, my God, poor Omarosa, please, spare me.
Yeah, I think we have one of your tweets to put on the screen. I'm not sure it's the one that needs to be bleeped or not, but if you guys have that graphic, we could throw it up. Can you explain what this so Omarosa, when you said every critic, every detractor will have to bow down to President Trump, does that now include you? Oh, and I guess POTUS being a racist wasn't enough to stop you from working for him. Hashtag not credible.
Well, that, you know, when she sort of broke into the news cycle with the book and some of the early interviews on this. That interview that she gave where she looked in the camera and very seriously told America that all of you detractors, all of you who ever said a bad word about Donald Trump, you will bow down to Donald Trump. I'm sitting there going, well, does that include you? Because clearly you're one of those detractors. So it just is so disingenuous. It is so reality TV yesterday. And I agree with you, Cornell. This is now an infection of our politics, and it's unfortunate. So for all of us, we should just kind of stop it.
Yeah. So the part of Chuck's interview from earlier that is possibly drawing the most attention is a secret recording that Omarosa claims she made in the Situation Room. The Situation Room, as she was being removed from the White House for what Chief of Staff John Kelly called, quote, integrity violations.
I think it's important to understand that if we make this a friendly departure, we can all be, you know, you can look at your time here in the White House as a year of service to the nation, and then you can go on without any type of difficulty in the future relative to your reputation.
White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders just released a statement tonight that reads, quote, the very idea a staff member would sneak a recording device into the White House Situation Room shows a blatant disregard for our national security. And then to brag about it on national television further proves the lack of character and integrity of this disgruntled former White House employee. So Joyce Vance, just kind of from your perspective as a former law enforcement official, is she in any legal jeopardy here doing something like this? I mean, is there anything she's opening herself up to? And also, did you read anything into kind of what John Kelly said to her at the top? It sounded to me like perhaps he suspected she might be recording the entire thing, making mention to lawyers that were present in the room and then refusing to explain further.
There's likely a technical crime or two that's been committed here. Obviously, prosecutors don't choose to prosecute every technical crime that's been committed, but she probably should get herself a lawyer and be in consultation. I think your second point is a pretty interesting one, though. Typically, I wouldn't think that the president's chief of staff would need to take an employee into the Situation Room to fire them. And it seems like he may have taken her into the Situation Room, contemplating that as a secure facility, she wouldn't be able to take a phone or another recording device in with her. And it's an incredible lapse, frankly, of security in this White House that she was in the Situation Room with a phone at all, whether it was recording or not. So a lot of different layers here to peel back.
Yep. Eli Stoeckels, what's your sort of view on this as somebody who has covered the interactions of this White House? Are you surprised by John Kelly's conduct or by the fact that this phone was in the Situation Room, or is it actually just how business is done?
No, I mean, the Omarosa episode of this presidency is the least surprising one that we've seen yet, right? This is a reality TV president. We have a reality TV contestant. They put her in the White House. She was fired in season 1. Like, what do you think is going to happen? And the fact is, there's never been any process or protocol in this West Wing. That's part of it. And so in a normal administration, it would be shocking that someone like Omarosa would be in the Situation Room with a recording device.
Or just in the Situation Room at all.
Exactly. but this is not, you know, and when the White House comes out and says puts out these statements, you know, the other day it was the president who directed staff to put out the first statement. He wanted to respond to this book. Then they put out another one today about the interviews this morning. This is bothering the president. He doesn't like it. And the statements make sense. It does reflect on Omarosa's character to be doing this. But the question always comes next. Why was she there? Why was she given this position? Why was she given a $180,000 taxpayer salary? And I think we know what the answer is. The answer is there were not a lot of minorities who were willing to go.
I think Cornell knows the answer.
The answer that. You took her answer. It's called tokenism.
I mean, that, you know, and it's hard to say when you're a reporter reporting on this White House, but there are not, there's nobody else in there. Kellyanne Conway got a question this morning. Well, who's the next highest ranking black official in the White House? She's pretty good in these interviews at vamping, and she was stumped.
So let me clarify the record for everybody. To take us back in time between November and January, and then January till about March of this year, of 2017, when you talk about African Americans coming into the White House, I was part of a small group that had put together a very comprehensive list of African American Republicans who had served in prior administrations, who were willing to come in and assist this president and to transition and all of that. You know who blocked those very same African Americans from getting the consideration they would want or need to have a position in the administration? None other than the one and only Omarosa. So, you know, this plaintive cry about, well, I'm the only African American, well, that's how you wanted it. Because you blocked the people that we had put together to submit to the White House through Chris Christie and his team at the time, and that didn't happen. So don't cry out that river.
Well, to have this epiphany right when you're trying to sell a book.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, she's known him for a decade. It's
also remarkable. I'm sorry that we have to press pause. We're already over time. When we continue, Rudy Giuliani says that conversation between the president and James Comey about letting go of the Michael Flynn investigation never happened. File that under big if true. Kasie DC back after this.
This is the president speaking. I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. He is a good guy. I hope you can let this go. Now, those are his exact words. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you wrote them here and you put them in quotes?
Correct. I took it as a direction.
Right.
I mean, this is the President of the United States with me alone saying, I hope this. I took it as this is what he wants me to do.
That was former FBI Director James Comey testifying before Congress back in June of 2017 about the now infamous conversation he had with President Trump about Michael Flynn. Now, the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is claiming that conversation never happened, directly contradicting his own comments from just a month ago.
So you're saying that President Trump and James Comey never discussed Michael Flynn?
That is what he will testify to if he's asked that question. They already know that. So why are they asking us for him to repeat what they already know under oath?
And you're also saying that a month ago you didn't tell ABC News that he said something along the lines of can you give him a break?
No, I did not. I said that is what Comey says.
I just want to play the sound so people understand why I asked the question.
Sure. Okay.
How is he a good witness for the president if he's saying that the president was asking him, directing him, in his words, to let the Michael Flynn investigation go?
He didn't direct him to do that. What he said to him was, can you give him a break?
Comey says he...
So
Well,
you
that-
didn't direct him to what he said was,
okay.
can you give a break? You said that. I mean,
Yeah, I said it, but I also said before that I'm talking about their version of it. Look, lawyers argue in the alternative. I know it's complicated, but my goodness, we've been over it long enough that, I mean, why would I say something that isn't true?
Joyce Vance, the dissembling we often get from Rudy Giuliani on, whatever iteration of the defense that they are trying to mount on the president's behalf, whatever they are trying to claim. This seems like a remarkable and very clear instance where Rudy Giuliani did acknowledge that that conversation, some version of that conversation, had taken place, and now he is saying that it didn't.
I think we're long past the point, sadly enough, where we can take anything that comes out of Giuliani's mouth at face value. He's here to run a PR strategy for the president to either confuse the American people or simply to turn them off to the point where they won't be outraged when the president's multiple failures, including the failure to testify, come to light. And if we get to the point where there are impeachment proceedings, this is really about keeping the public from demanding that their elected representatives move forward with impeachment, much more than it's a legal strategy. But, if this is true, and if the president in fact contests Jim Comey's statement, then the best way for him to clear this up is to agree to do that interview with special counsel Robert Mueller, to go in and to tell his version of what happened, to give them credibility points that they can test his version against Comey's, and to let the special counsel zero out the allegations that Comey has made. The president's failure to show any willingness to do that is something that really cuts against the truthfulness of Giuliani's comments here.
Is there any way to really prove this, Joyce? I mean, if the president insists that the conversation with Comey never happened and Comey says it did, I mean, how do prosecutors figure out who's telling the truth?
Sure. So it's a he said, she said sort of situation. And if prosecutors were going to file charges about this specific incident, they would have to believe that they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the president did this. It could be part of a conspiracy or some other charges, but if they're directly going to talk about this incident, they've got to be able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay. If it's just Jim Comey's word against the president's, then I wouldn't expect them to go forward. But that's not to say that there couldn't be some circumstantial guarantees, including the fact that the president ushered in effect everyone else out of the room for this very unusual one-on-one conversation between the president and the FBI director.
Of course, okay. Meanwhile, the president snuck in a broadside against Attorney General Jeff Sessions in a tweet yesterday, calling him, quote, scared stiff and missing in action. And it certainly wasn't the first time he's publicly shamed his own attorney general. Let's run through some of the other notable examples. In a July 2017 tweet, the president called him, quote, beleaguered. A day later, he said he had taken a, quote, very weak position on Hillary Clinton crimes. After Sessions appointed an inspector general to investigate potential FISA abuse instead of doing it himself in February, Trump called the decision, quote, disgraceful. And who could forget the Washington Post report back in April that Trump was referring to his attorney general as, quote, Mr. Magoo. Eli Stokols, how is Jeff Sessions possibly effective as the Attorney General of the United States when his boss, the President of the United States, is talking about him in such fashion?
I don't know that he is. And for the purposes of the investigation, he's recused himself. That's obviously why the President is angry about this at the end of the day. But he's not having any impact on that. And the President, as much as he likes to spout off on Twitter, does not really like to fire people. And so that's why Sessions is still there. And, I think
Wait, the you're fired President doesn't like to fire people?
It's amazing, right? But that's the reality. I mean, he has the ability to fire Sessions if he wants to. He hasn't done that even despite months of attacking him on Twitter.
Kasie, I have a bit of a different twist on it. I agree with everything you say, but I do think that Jeff Sessions is is doing exactly to a certain extent what he wants to do and what the president wants to do. Because when you look at the way he's rolling back a lot of common sense criminal justice reform acts, and when he's throwing out a lot of the work that the Obama administration did right up the street here in Baltimore around reform, he's rolling that back and he's trying to implement the 1980s law and order sort of nonsense that we threw out a long time and locking more people up and building more prisons. He's being very effective at that.
It's a good point, and we are so often talking about him in context of Russia that sometimes that does in fact get overlooked. Eli Stokols, Joyce Vance, thank you both so much for your time tonight. We really appreciate it. Still to come, white nationalists and counter-protesters take to the streets here in D.C. 1 year after the deadly riot in Charlottesville. But for many, today was also a day of mourning. We're back after this.
Please remember not to think of Heather, but think of why she was here. She was here to support equality. She was here to support affordable housing. She was here to support taking care of people the way that you would want to be taken care of.
Of course, today was also a day of mourning in Charlottesville. Heather Heyer was killed 1 year ago today after a man drove his car through a crowd of counter-protesters during last year's white nationalist rally. She was just 32 years old, and her mother, who you saw there, was laid flowers today on the makeshift memorial that also included, of course, 2 state troopers who were killed as they tried to keep the peace in the streets of Charlottesville. Mark Morial, I want to ask you, I mean, we've talked a lot about, obviously, how damaging this resurgence of white nationalism and white supremacy is to our national conversation. But the flip side of it is that we have seen a lot of Americans stand up, take to the streets, and say, no, this is not who we are. We are standing against this hateful speech and language. And, you know, in some ways, you know, it could be viewed through the most positive possible lens as an opportunity for people to show courage.
Well, I think people have shown courage out of necessity. I think there's a sense that this white supremacist movement can, because of the climate in the country, because of the rhetoric in the White House, become legitimized and become a normalized political force, which is extremely dangerous for the future of the nation. But what it has done is lit a fuse of activism among young people. It's compelled people to get organized. It's compelled people to examine their own commitments and their own consciousness. And I think that what it is doing is fueling. Look at the response. 30, if you will, neo-Nazi, alt-right, Unite the Right protesters, and thousands of people in opposition, and a lot of conversation going on in social media in support of the same. So you are right, but this is a necessity. I think this generation, my generation, your generation, we're saying we are not, in today's climate, going to allow the hands of time to be turned back without a fight, without a vigorous fight, without a passionate fight, without a political fight. We cannot let it reoccur. We cannot let it be normalized.
All right. Cornell Belcher, thank you very much for being on the show today. We will hear a little bit more from our other guests in just a bit. But just ahead, the Republican nominee for a congressional seat in Illinois denies that the Holocaust happened and doesn't support interracial marriage. We're going to introduce you to an independent candidate who is launching a long-shot write-in campaign to beat him. We're back after this. Welcome back to Kasie DC. The implications of today's march are reverberating in the race in Illinois' 3rd congressional district, as the Republican Party's sole candidate, Arthur Jones, has past neo-Nazi ties and is a Holocaust denier. Jones is running despite the National Party disavowing his candidacy. Here's a look at what he said during an interview with NBC News' Morgan Radford back in June.
Do you think that black people are genetically inferior?
The average IQ of a black person is about 20 points lower than the average IQ of a white person.
I went to Harvard.
All right. And you got a lot of white blood in you, too.
Some white blood. I'm African American.
Well, that's where your intelligence is coming from, I think.
You think it comes from my white side?
I think so.
Unbelievable. But for those unenthused about casting their vote for him or for Democratic incumbent Daniel Lipinski, a new write-in independent candidate has emerged. 35-year-old lawyer Justin Hansen, a former Republican Hill staffer, says he's running because, quote, men like Art Jones shouldn't be allowed to go unchallenged. And Justin Hansen joins me now on set. Justin, thanks so much for being here. Let's start simply. You launched your campaign in your backyard, and it sounds like you had an unwelcome visitor.
Yeah, Kasie, thank you for having me. It's good to be here. Yeah, we did. We had an unwelcome visitor at our family rally. It was just a group of family friends getting together to get excited about this campaign and where we're going with it. And yeah, Art Jones decided to show up to the campaign rally.
So what ensued? He challenged you to a debate?
He came to I was given a heads up that he might be coming to confront me at the rally that was in my backyard, and he challenged me on the idea that he tricked voters into voting for him in the primary. I asked him to leave my home. He challenged me to a debate on the Holocaust, which was
to debate whether or not the Holocaust exists.
Yeah, which was ridiculous.
So explain a little bit. You're running as an independent. You worked for Republicans in the past. Why should people vote for you over Dan Lipinski? And what's your rationale for mounting this long shot write-in campaign?
Yeah. So the reason why I'm running, there are really two reasons why I'm running, is because when voters in the 3rd District go to the ballot box this November, they don't have a choice that they deserve. Their first choice is a Nazi, Holocaust-denying, homophobic, bigot, white supremacist. That's the first choice. The other choice is Dan Lipinski. He's a nice man, but he's a longtime incumbent, 13 years in office. He does not have a good track record as far as his legislative accomplishments go, and he's just inadequately represented the district. The second reason why we're running is because it's just important to my wife and me that in today's day and age, that we're able to be a good example to our kids about what it means to stand up to hatred.
That's actually something that Republicans in Washington get a lot of criticism for. We are, I cover Capitol Hill every day. We were repeatedly asking Republican members of Congress to weigh in on the latest, tweet. And there was some condemnation, obviously, from leadership after the Charlottesville rally. But you're running as an independent, do you feel like you could still have a home in the Republican Party of Donald Trump or not?
I don't know. I think that if we are able to win in November, I think that it would send a loud signal to the rest of the country. The voters of my district would send a loud signal to the rest of the country that people are tired of this gridlock, they're tired of the partisanship, because we feel that a lot of people, Republicans and Democrats, just don't see themselves reflected perfectly in either party right now. And there's a lot of gridlock, we're talking past one another, and we're not getting a lot done. And I think that our election would speak to that.
One question I think some voters might have for you if they're considering not voting for the Democrat Dan Lipinski, he took a primary challenge primarily around the issue of abortion. He opposes abortion rights. Where do you stand on that? Do you support abortion rights? Yeah, abortion is a tough issue for me. It's tough for me as a parent and as a Catholic. But at the end of the day, I do believe that that right belongs to women, and that decision does not belong with the government. I am encouraged by the fact that the number of abortions sought by women every year is declining, and I think that everyone can agree that that's a good trend that we should work to continue. Justin Hansen, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time. In our next hour, our coverage continues as crowds take to the streets of rainy Washington, D.C. to protest. Plus, President Trump's first supporter in Congress won't run for re-election after being indicted for insider trading. Plus, the Kasie DVR. Our producers watch the Sunday morning shows so you don't have to. We're back after this. Welcome to our second hour of Kasie DC. Joining me on set, Chief Washington Correspondent and Editor-at-Large at CNBC, John Harwood. White House Bureau Chief for the Washington Post and MSNBC political analyst, Philip Rucker. He has brand new reporting on Donald Trump Jr. that we're going to get to just a little bit later. Senior advisor for MoveOn.org, Karine Jean-Pierre. And back with us for round two, former RNC chairman and MSNBC political analyst Michael Steele, and president of the National Urban League and former mayor of New Orleans, Mark Morial. But we want to start, of course, with NBC's Mike Vaquera. He is near the White House and has been in the rain all day covering this rally for us. Mike, it seems like the promised 100